So let me now just introduce the speakers that we have here. On my right, not ideologically, is Martyn Williams, who's the Senior Campaigner, Senior Parliamentary Campaigner here at Friends of the Earth. He's been with the organisation for about 14 years and he's led numerous campaigns through Parliament and into law. At the moment, he's very much piloting the climate change bill through Parliament. This is the bill that came out of the Big Ask campaign. It was the centre of our Big Ask campaign, and it's going to be setting legally binding targets for CO2 emissions. But above and beyond that, on Martyn's very impressive CV and feedback. Okay, a very impressive CV, which I've picked out here. He coordinated the coalition behind the passing of the Warm Homes and Energy Conservation Act. And if you're wondering what that did, actually it's incredible. It legally requires the government to end fuel poverty by 2016. And also was responsible for piloting the campaign through on the Household Waste Recycling Act, which ensures every home will have doorstep recycling by 2010. On my left, we have Natalie Bennett, whose background is originally in newspapers in Australia before she moved to Bangkok, where she worked for the National Commission on Women and then for the United Nations, working around on women and children's issues in Southeast Asia, before moving to the UK in 1999. And she's worked as a journalist both at the Times and the Independent, and she's currently the editor of the Guardian Weekly, and told her also founder of the blog Carnival of Feminists. Yes,
that's right. Yes.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, so I've got a series of questions. Let me quickly go through. It's a very creative question that people put here. So the first one I've got here, let me start with you, Natalie, is why, a very profound one, why is nobody happy with the world?
I'm surprised at this, actually. You're saying it's a very creative question, yet it's drawn most beautifully in a way that drawn beautifully looks like the person who drew it was happy. Right. So I think at one level, of course, you can't say that no one is happy. I'm sure some people in this room would probably define themselves as being happy. But there is no doubt, actually, that we are self-identified as less happy than we used to be. BBC did a poll in 1957 asking exactly the same question. 52% of people said they were happy. They asked the question a couple of years ago, and it was only 36%. Now, if you think back, we were looking just in the old days of austerity Britain. If you looked at the living conditions, the way things were, you would have thought, gosh, things have improved, but it seems people are now happier. Probably, undoubtedly, it's a case that it's a question partly of expectations. Today we expect much more from life, and if life doesn't always deliver, then we feel somehow let down, disappointed, sad. But we have to ask the question, what makes us happy? And I was thinking about this. If you, I happen to be a school governor in one of my many other lives, and if we took a group of 5-year-olds from my school and you asked them what would make them happy, if when they're growing up, what do you think would make you happy? I'm sure you'd get answers like, oh, I want a Ferrari. Or I want to live in a really big house and fly overseas lots of times. We think that stuff makes us happy. We think that wealth makes us happy. But actually we know as grown-ups, we're a little bit further down the road hopefully, and we actually know, and we can look at surveys that say having lots more money doesn't make you any happier. This particular government in particular, I think, often seems to suggest that choice will make us happy. We've got lots of choices about things. And in some ways that's true. I was thinking about this, and I'm very happy about the fact that as a woman I could decide to live an independent life, move around the world, live in different continents, be independent, not have to tie myself to a man. Some aspects of choice are great. But sometimes, those restaurants you go to, those really posh restaurants, which I try and avoid, where you get a menu, and it's not so much a menu as a book. And you think, oh, I've got to make some choice out of this, and I'll probably make the wrong one, and what I'll order I won't like nearly as much as the person opposite me has. So what we've really got to do is start to think about what choices do make us happy, where we need choice, and perhaps where we don't need so much choice.
Never mind restaurants, it's washing powder in a supermarket is bad enough, I think. There's so many things that all do the same thing, and I think the confusion that choice can create it can be quite baffling. That's why it's easy to just buy Ecover, I find. Choose the green one, and you've solved the problem. Because many supermarkets have more than one of those. But yeah, as soon as I saw the question, I thought, well, I am happy, so it's wrong for a start. So that's nice and easy to get it out of the way. But it did sort of strike me that there's no question about this. More and more politicians are looking at happiness and how you make people happy rather than how you make people wealthy, and trying to reframe their debates. I mean, we've had David Cameron doing it in part of his sort of fluffier earlier time in Parliament, when he started talking about general well-being as a measure of how the country is doing instead of gross domestic product, and being that should be the way that we measure whether we're a successful country or not. And also, you do see big differences in which countries have happy people living in them and which countries have less happy people living in them. And it does seem to be the case that sort of Scandinavian models tend to make people happier. Ultra-competitive, more Anglo-Saxon, maybe even American models tend to make less people happy. And there does, I think, seem to be a very big correlation between happiness and division in society. So if you've got a big division between the haves and the have-nots, the rich and the poor, the wealthy and the not wealthy, whatever you want to call it, then that seems to be the thing that makes people a bit less happy, rather than all rubbing along together a bit better, even if you haven't got quite so much to rub along with. I think the only thing I'd say is that that's all great, but it only works when you've reached a certain level. You have to reach a level where you can subsist and be prosperous and eat enough, those sorts of things, for this happiness to work. I think once you've gone past that subsistence level, I agree with everything Natalie has said, but I think prior to that, if you are left with serious health problems, serious food problems, serious housing problems, it's a much more difficult thing, and you've got every justification to be unhappy in such situations.
What do you say about, for example, Bhutan, where it's instead of the gross domestic product, it's the gross happiness product, isn't it? And you have a country that many people would probably see as not developed.
Yeah, and there are other places as well where you would hear similar ideas. I mean, it may be particularly countries where you don't have a food problem. You may have a relatively sort of peasant existence, in the sense that everybody's having to grow their own food, and they're not relying on great deals of machinery or going to huge numbers of shops, but the food they're growing is healthy and sustains them largely. Then perhaps you do see a different lifestyle to the sort of stressed out way that we can live in a city, and panicking about whether the tube will be there, whether you're going to get on the bus, all the rest of it. So I don't know about. I've never had the luck of travelling to Bhutan, and of course now flights are off the agenda so much that I probably never will do. But certainly, so having travelled in various other places, I've never really seen the correlation between the wealth and the happiness that you would expect here.
The thing about Bhutan, I've never been to Bhutan either, but when I lived and worked in Southeast Asia, I knew quite a few people who had been, one of the other things about Bhutan is also that there's been a very, very strong drive to maintain the existing culture there. They've basically kept out sort of American movies, they've kept out lots of technology, and that does reduce choice, and maybe there are some freedom issues there, although of course Bhutan has just become the world's newest democracy as dictated by the king, which is a very interesting concept, but it seems to have worked, and the people actually voted and made a very clear choice in that election. But what they've voted for is stability. They quite like what they're doing now, so they rather think they can do without Rambo movies.
I quite like I've not heard it called the gross happiness product, but I like the Cameron idea of general well-being, because it sounded quite military. Like you had a bloke who sort of came in with a big stick to force everybody to have a bit of well-being brought in. So I think we could do with a better name for it, to be honest. I think there's a problem with whichever one you come up with.
Well, actually brings us very nicely onto the second question I've got here. Maybe you can answer this, Martyn, first. Got it here. How can we break away from a consumerist culture / society where everything we do, whether it's work, education, living, requires stuff? The stuff we buy doesn't last, and we constantly have to upgrade it, and we throw away what we create, and we create waste. How can we stop this? How can we stop this vicious cycle?
Confession now, Natalie and I met in a pub where we did a bit of consuming in order to discuss this earlier on in the week. And,
but it was European wine, so that's all right. Or beer.
But one of the things, because obviously, first of all, you think, well, yeah, no, we've got to consume less stuff, we've got to stop buying these things. We could both think of people who do just love to shop, love to go and get all sorts of things. But I've got to admit, I quite like doing it as well, in a way. I mean, I hate going to shops, I hate supermarkets, I hate busy shopping centres or town centres, but I do quite like stuff. But the stuff I like, I think, as I've, inevitably, as life's gone on, got a bit more money, got a bit less of a mortgage to pay off, a bit more disposable income. The stuff that I've bought actually seems to last longer than the old stuff. It's better quality. And all my examples of things I like to consume, which I'm consuming maybe not more of, but better quality of, is things like better wine, better food, better beer it was on Wednesday night, but that was a different thing. And even things like, the music I listen to at home. I'm a great music lover. So over the years, I've never had anything that wasn't second-hand, but I've improved my stereo equipment twice in 30 years. But I now have this sort of beautiful sounding and quite good to look at, although it's all sort of shut away, stereo that I can listen to. Fantastic sound quality, really enjoyable just to sit back and relax and hear these amazing music. That stuff's going to last me forever. I mean, some of it, second-hand bits of amplifiers and stuff, 30 years old already, and I'm still using it. So in a way, this greater consumption, I think you can have greater consumption, greater in terms of quality and not in terms of quantity. And the question is how you sort of get the shoppers in Primark or the shoppers, and you know, shoppers in Primark. By that, I don't mean people who can only afford to shop in Primark, because I know you get shot down in flames, so you can't stop people who can't afford anything more expensive going there. There's an awful lot of pretty well-off people shop in Primark because it means they can have a new top every week and something different every other week. But how do you get through to them that maybe better quality clothes would last longer, would have less of the sort of bad side of that global manufacture of clothing it locked up in it, so you wouldn't be worrying about low-paid wages in other countries and all the rest of it, and get them to sort of appreciate the things they buy and use and keep longer. And making that shift, I think, is difficult, but I don't actually think it's about saying you can't consume, you can't have any stuff, you can't have anything. There's one other thing I'll just say. I bought a little gadget just before Christmas, which is I really like, because to me it exposes this dilemma between this sort of contrast between the two things. It's one of the most beautifully made things I've got in my house. It's made of plastic. It cost about 150 quid, which was ridiculous, but it just appealed to me. It's incredibly luxurious and designer-made and everything else, and it tells me how much electricity I'm using at any one moment. And it has this amazing impact on you. You see the number, and if you turn the lights on, you see the number go up. You know, you go up to sort of 500 watts or back down again. And I love the fact that I've spent a ridiculous amount of money on something that is intrinsically completely stingy and trying to make me consume less. And I like that conflict between the two. And I think that it's called a Watson meter, and they've featured all over the place. I think they were #1 gadget in Stuff magazine, you know, which is more famous for Ferraris and things. But I like the fact that somehow we've got to almost sell people gadgets that make them lose less. And I like that contrast there is just in that one thing. I should have brought it with me and put it on the table so we could all see how much electricity we would use. And I bet Jules would turn the lights off at the back, because that's what it makes you do.
I mean, I broadly agree with that. I mean, I think I sometimes encounter people in the Green Movement who say, isn't it really obscene that someone spent £1,000 on a handbag? And actually, it's much better that they spend £1,000 on one handbag than £1,000 on 10 handbags, because there's a great deal more effort, energy, all of those things go into that, generally speaking, making sure they're the same materials and all the rest of it. So I think we do have to encourage people to say, well, you know, if I can buy things, buy something really nice, but buy a relatively environmentally friendly thing and buy one of it rather than a lot of stuff. But I think there is a problem. I'm going brand name here, but I'm thinking there's someone who I know who shall obviously remain nameless, who I think of as Topshop Woman. And basically she spends most of every weekend, a good amount of her spare time and some of her working time on the internet shopping. She buys huge amounts of stuff. She's always broke. And I'm sure, you know, most of the items in her wardrobe she hasn't worn more than 2 or 3 times. And, you know, she basically has to sort of, on Saturday afternoon, she brings the load of shopping in and takes the load of shopping out. She does at least, I think, take it to the charity shop, but still, there's just that enormous, and her pleasure, the only way she thinks, coming back to the happiness questions, she thinks that shopping makes her happy. And there's something very fundamentally wrong in our society that so many people have got that message. Mm-hmm. And I'm afraid I don't know how we overcome that message. I really don't.
I'm conscious of the time, but I'd love to actually explore that a lot more about all the ethical consumption and class and disposable income, and maybe some people in the audience will come back in terms of that. Something, again, maybe start with you, Martyn, because very much in your area, is around the climate change bill. You know, we've got this massive campaign, big-ass campaign, it's very much in the public media, and yet when you're out on the streets, so few people have heard about the climate change bill. And so what are the chances of it actually being made actually worthwhile by getting something like the 80% CO2 cuts that we need?
I think there's 2 things about this. I mean, when you say, why have so few people heard of it? I don't know. I'm always tempted to turn it back on you. I said, tell me another bill that's in the Queen's, that is going through Parliament at the minute. No, you'll do that. You tell me the energy bill. That's cheating. But if I threw it out to the public and said, what piece of legislation is going through Parliament at the minute? You know, there's about 20, 25 of them. And I'm struggling to think, beyond the 2 that we're working on at Friends of the Earth, what else there is out there.
There's a crime bill, because there's always a crime bill.
There's always a crime bill, that's true, yeah. But there'll be a finance bill as well, because one of those every year. But it isn't going to be top of people's mind that there is a climate bill going through Parliament. On the other hand, you know, we've seen levels of activity. We've seen it reaching an audience from Friends of the Earth point of view of a scale that we've never seen before. And of course, most important, if you ask any member of Parliament who's actually got a vote on the thing, is there a climate bill going through Parliament, they will not only know about it, they will also know what the key issues that need to be resolved on it are. And those are, after all, the people that are going to pass the thing. They're the ones who we most need to get to. So it's a tricky one. Why don't people take more notice of current affairs generally is a fair comment. I don't think it's particularly fair criticism of the climate bill any more than it is of any other issue. What are the chances of making it worthwhile and making it work? Well, I mean, for those of you who have come to this a little bit new, the climate bill was an idea that we put forward about 3 years ago, and it was really based on the fact that we had all our political parties, that's not a party political issue, all of them had set very ambitious targets to cut carbon dioxide emissions by 2050. Really big problem with this is that carbon dioxide emissions weren't going down, they were going up instead. And there was a fairly obvious reason for that, and it's what we call in the trade 2050 targets, or what we call NIMTO targets. They're not in my term of office. And if they're not in your term of office, you don't have to do anything about them, because someone else will get the blame when they're missed. So we said we need to break this long-term target, because you have to have that much of a vision to tackle climate change. We need to break it down into steps, and we need to make governments legally accountable for where emissions are going every year, to make sure that this government does its bit to get us towards 2050, the next one does, the one after that, and all probably 10 governments between now and 2050 all do their fair share. And we put that forward as a law, and we were considered to be nuts. I mean, I was very involved right at the very start of it. I went out to talk to other environment groups, to friendly politicians, to all sorts of people, and everybody thought we were mad. But I think what we've done is, through the campaign, is to convince people that, no, this is the framework we need. It meets the science, meets the political challenge of governments not really doing stuff in the long term. And gradually, bit by bit, people have been converted, people have got the idea. Huge amounts of work by our local people in convincing their local MPs. It's been a very sort of bottom-up approach, really, which has led to the fact that now it is regarded as a completely sensible thing to do. This week, Wednesday I think it was, for the first time, or maybe Thursday, the Times carried an article by a Tory MP attacking the bill, and that is the first attack I have seen on the idea of a climate change bill from any member of Parliament anywhere. Now, he's a one-off lone Tory, sits on his own on the backbenches. The Tory party were mortified that people might think this was their formal position. I really think that, whether everybody in the street knows about it, to have found one MP in the last 3 years who's prepared to put his name in print as saying it's a silly idea, I think we're doing pretty well.
I mean, I think there's been a progression in general society views towards climate change, that more and more people are accepting that it's real. But I think there is a problem, actually, as it increasingly is, gets more and more and more frightening. It becomes that great elephant in the room that people don't want to talk about, don't even want to think about. And there is that problem as climate change looks so scary, and suddenly you've got. I was walking in the hills in Burgundy in February, and the butterflies were out, which I found extremely frightening, because you really shouldn't have butterflies in Burgundy forest in February. But as the problem just suddenly starts to look so big, there really is a problem. Everyone just goes, there's an enormous problem, so right, I'm just going to worry about some little minor issue over here because it's much easier. And I think this is a problem that campaigners like you, Martyn, are going to run into increasingly, that it's just such a big problem that politicians would much rather run off and do something more manageable. And that really is going to be a challenge, I think.
Of course, there's another problem as well. And, front page of The Guardian today it's largely about the government trying to get out of its commitments on providing renewable energy by just finding other ways of accounting for it and saying it's going to meet its targets by counting it in a different way, which is a standard response by this government to a difficult target. Change the way you count it. That's always the answer. But it actually says at the bottom, and it shows this sort of, once again, this huge lead towards nuclear. And when it's a big problem, people think you need big solutions, and therefore if you can't have a massive, great, big solution to it that you can cut the ribbon on and say this is open, it doesn't seem to match up. The idea of changing light bulbs to tackle the problem, it's a mismatch between the huge problem of climate change and changing a little light bulb somewhere. And yet, really, the biggest challenge is to make the little things like the light bulbs happen all over the place. It is much more difficult to get millions and millions of people to change light bulbs than it is to build one big thing, which is a very centralised and straightforward thing for a politician to do. And I think that's going to be the challenge.
Well, Natalie, I mean, look, some of these challenges, and one of the big challenges, obviously, at the moment is being posed to us that the threat is so big that we have to have nuclear. One of the other, clearly, is about renewables, and there's an interesting question here about how we reconcile conflicting environmental interests, and the question is actually asked about the proposal to build wind farms in the Lake District, which was imposed by environmentalists, and so it actually didn't happen. How do we reconcile these different environmental concerns?
In a way, I've got a very simple answer to that, which is simply climate change is it. That is the problem. Climate change is going to have enormous impacts over the next 50 or 100 years. Lots of things are going to be damaged by that. And if you take the Lake District issue, people were concerned that the wind farms would be of risk to birds and that they'd destroy the scenery. But the fact is, unless we take some very radical steps very quickly, climate change is going to destroy huge numbers of species, huge number of beautiful species we value, huge number of beautiful landscapes that we value. And so we do have to, there has to be a cost-benefit analysis in the sort of old traditional economic terms, but a cost-benefit analysis in the terms of if we don't really do something to get into renewable energy in a big way, then maybe that wind turbine will take out a couple of beautiful hawks, and that will be really sad. But those hawks, or their successive, their children and their grandchildren hawks, are going to fall to climate change anyway. So in a way, my answer to that's very simple. Climate change is the thing we've got to tackle, and if that does cause some damage along the way, that's sad, but it just has to be done.
You have to deal with this on a day-to-day basis, Martyn, internally in the building.
I think we should point out that these environmentalists didn't include Friends of the Earth. We were supporting that wind farm, so it was other environmental groups. I don't know, it seemed to me at the time that they were mostly objecting that the view was going to be spoiled from the M6, without noticing that the M6 was possibly spoiling the view as well. I do agree with Natalie, because that is the overall challenge. On the other hand, I've also got a slight view. We are prepared to pay money to protect certain areas, or for listed buildings, or for things that we do find beautiful and that we want to have in our environment. I think you can argue about all of the buildings which get listed, but we do, as a society, we recognise the value in protecting certain things. And I think one of the questions is, wind farms are quite an obvious one. If you put them on top of a hill, it's windy, they generate a lot of electricity. They also can be seen from everywhere, and I'm not one of those people. I actually quite like wind turbines, but I think it's subjective whether they're nice and beautiful and elegant or not, and therefore I don't think that just because I like them I should impose them on everyone. I don't think there's anything wrong with society thinking we can have one wind farm on the top of the hill with its visual impact, or we can pay for 2 wind farms to be put over there where no one will see them, but it's not quite so windy. Now, it makes the energy less commercially viable. It makes it more expensive per unit and all the rest of it. But if we're prepared to pay the extra price for a listed building to be preserved, then why shouldn't we pay a little bit of extra money on our renewables to make sure we get it? But that can only be done within a framework of making sure that we are living within the sort of carbon limits which we have to live in. And if it means we need 20,000 wind farms instead of 10,000 wind farms because they're in different places, I think we as a society should be grown up about it and say that's it. That's what we'll do then.
Mm-hmm. No, agreement on this one. Martyn, got a question here saying, is there a national policy anywhere on this planet that is serious about fighting climate change? And can you name it, where it is?
There's a lot of countries that have got NIMTO targets, which are very serious about tackling climate change. Some of the Scandinavian countries are promising to go carbon-free by 2030, 2040, 2050. They vary a little bit. Iceland's got quite spectacular policies. Sadly, they've also got loads of volcanoes directly underneath them that they can tap into to generate their hydrogen, so it's not immediately transferable to here, despite our earthquake the other week. So there are countries around where you can point to things. I think more interesting is when you look at the best country or city or town in the world for its transport services, and then you have to look at a different one for its housing, and then you have to look at a different one for the way in which they generate electricity. And actually what all countries need to do is to combine that. So you need the public transport system of Freiburg, along with the building regulations of Sweden, and probably combined with the sort of wind generation of Denmark, and then you've got about the best country going. And the really frustrating thing is that here in the UK we could do most of those things, particularly the wind generation. We've got the longest coastline of any country in Europe, and a huge scope to do it. We've got a housing stock that desperately needs bringing back up to date. It could create huge numbers of jobs, could make people a lot warmer, prevent what we still have in this country, that when we have cold weather in the winter, we see a huge increase in the death rate, because that cold weather causes people to be cold, which puts them at risk of more illness, makes them more likely to have heart attacks. Elderly people, if they're cold, are actually just more likely to fall over, and a fall for an elderly person can often lead to all sorts of complications and worse. So we're living with this terrible housing stock, which could be modernised with the creation of loads of jobs, with the creation of much better environments for all of us, and without making people feel that they were being, taxed and done down and everything was bad that you had to do for climate change, we would work out better. I think that's the frustration, is that we're not moving to that combination of different cities that we need to follow.
My first reaction to this when I heard this is, what countries have a real climate change policy? I thought the ones that are going to disappear under the ocean waves in the next couple of decades, the Maldives, the Fijis, places like that. And indeed, in support of that theory, actually last night they got a resolution through the UN saying for the first time that climate change is a human rights issue. And that, in its own way, in the way of that terribly rigid and sometimes very bureaucratic UN framework, is quite important. But then I also thought about it, what do those countries' economies depend on? Tourism. Where are they? In the middle of absolutely nowhere. What are they all trying to do, frantically do? Grow their tourism industry. So it's, the fact is that even the countries that are going to be most affected, that are suffering, are actually, in a small way admittedly, but are actually making the problem worse simply by living the way they do. So in short, the answer is, I don't think there is a country that has got it right.
Yeah. Well, the question here, actually, if we're looking at countries that have got it right and we're looking at politicians then to implement some of these, there's a question here: how can the present untrustworthy and compromised politicians ever deliver anything of environmental value anyway? So is it a false question to say that there is a national policy anywhere?
But there are national policies in all sorts of places. The question is, do they add up yet? To the funny thing about climate change, actually, is it's incredibly complicated. We can all talk about loads and loads of scientific problems and detail of getting everything together. But actually, it's not very complicated at all. It is, in fact, really simple. We can put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. That's okay, as long as the carbon dioxide is taken back out of the atmosphere by natural processes like the plankton and forests growing and all the rest of it, at least the same rate as we're putting it in, because that way the concentration doesn't increase. And the best analogy I've ever really thought of for carbon dioxide is it's a bit like a diet. You can have as many faddy diets as you want about not mixing your proteins and your whatever it is and only eating things that begin with B on Tuesdays or whatever. But actually all of us really know in our heart of hearts that you get fatter when you eat more calories than you burn up, and you get thinner when you burn up more calories than you eat. And it's as simple as that. Climate change is no different. And I don't think there will be a serious policy on climate change until there is a country that has said, this is the limit to the carbon dioxide that we can put into the atmosphere, and we as a country can only put out, the 1%, we're 1% of the population, so we can have 1% of that limit of carbon dioxide, and that's what we can put out. And it's a limit that builds up over time. So you can sit and talk about whether the building standards here are equal to the public transport system there, and whether they match what so-and-so is doing on flights and who's making the greenest cars in Germany or whatever, but does a country have a policy which adds up to living within that sort of carbon diet, if you like? And at the minute, the answer is no. And I suppose the good news is the closest we've got to it is the climate change bill. It is likely to be flawed. It's not likely to be perfect the first time round. There are likely to be fudge factors where we say, this is the carbon diet, but no one else is doing it, so we're not going to go quite that far. That's likely to be some of the early sort of rounds of the climate change bill. But that is the framework which I think makes the whole thing serious. And then you need a policy response which is a little bit like the budget every year. Not that you will get it right. None of us will get it right. None of us know how to do it, if we're really honest. But what we will do is put forward a series of policies that we think will get us there, measure to see whether it has got us there, and if it hasn't, we'll add some more. If it's got us further than we need to go, we can do a bit less. Because when Gordon Brown announces, well, it's not Gordon Brown anymore, is it? It's Alistair Darling. When he announces the budget each year, and he says how much tax he'll bring in, he never brings that much in the following year. It's always a bit more or a bit less. So he adjusts for the next year. And that's the way we need to be tackling climate change in years to come.
But I think in terms of the question, I mean, it is a problem of how, what was the term you were using?
NIMTO.
NIMTO. Politicians are elected for 4, 5, whatever year terms, and it's very, very hard to get them to look behind that basis. I mean, I think one of the problems is that, we all know that we've got a whole lot of mostly careerist politicians out there at the moment. I think it's truly frightening how many politicians in Parliament have never, ever had a real job outside being a politician one way or another. And I think, one of the things, it looks a bit distant from all of this climate change and environmental questions generally at first glance, but, if we were to reform the voting system so that the people we elected in all sorts of ways in terms of views, in terms of who they are, much more closely reflected who we are, sitting here in this room, out there on the street outside, and all of those. And we all know that our current voting system just doesn't deliver things like that. And the whole thing's set up like a football match, that my side's going to beat your side. And as long as we do that in half a dozen or a dozen, or maybe 20 marginal electorates, then we're going to win. And that's just the whole way everything is set up. So we really do have to have, I think, to really achieve these things, we have to have a fundamental change in politics.
I agree with that, but I think we should take a little bit of blame ourselves as well. I don't mean necessarily people in this room, but as a public. How many people have received that email that's doing the rounds that says, what company of 600 people includes 86 people who beat their wives, 324 have done... It's been going around, and when you get to the end, the company of 600 people happens to turn out to be the House of Commons. And the whole thing is rubbish from start to finish. And yet, it seems to be being forwarded. I've had it about 4 times from people going, cool, you wouldn't believe it, would you? Look what they like, you know. And they're not like that, actually. But we want them to be. There's something about us that wants our politicians to be corrupt, miserable, you know, useless. I won't go on. And I think there is something about us that actually, you know, what our politicians do is actually quite largely down to us as well. It is us that votes for them. It is us that holds them to pressure in between the elections. And I don't, you know, if it's easy to sit back and say they're all cynical and useless and everything else, and it's just a little bit harder to get involved and actually change it. And it's partly down to the public to make sure they start doing that.
Let me get a perfect note to go to the audience. Anything you've heard, any comments, any thoughts, or any questions that you may have? Jules, can I take lady there in the red top there, please? Yeah. If you wait till you get the mic in your hand. If you could just say your name, an organisation, or if a question to any of the people.
Just going back to what Natalie was saying, being a female who likes clothes. I saw a Global Oneness Project film a few weeks ago where people were burying their children in the earth to keep them warm because they were so short of fabric. And there is a project in India that is now collecting fabric. I've looked at shop alcoholism, or whatever you call it. I buy a lot of my lovely clothes from charity shops. I know where the good ones are. I've also had ideas over the years that we could set up clothing banks where you could just go and borrow exciting gear. And I think fundamentally, we're looking for beauty, and we've kind of projected a lot of that into glamour and shopping and filling a need. And I've just been reading, what is his name? The man who wrote Anam Cara, Divine Beauty. And I think he's saying very clearly, we're very afraid of beauty. It's seen as naff, there's a lot of sneering. I'm a youth worker, and I work with young people who are ripping up the world all the time. And I think there are things we need to address. We need to study violence. We need to study conflict. We need to go right into the heart of it and work it through. That's what I'm beginning to do in my work, and there are other people that are beginning to do that too, so that we stop splitting and projecting it out, but really begin to take self-responsibility. Thank you.
Just hold that. I'm going to take 3 questions, and then I'll ask you to come respond. So the gentleman here at the front, just wait for the mic. And if you could keep your questions or contributions very short, I'm going to try and get as many in as possible.
The question that seems to be being discussed generally is whether the planet is going to survive. It seems to me the planet will survive. It's whether we are going to survive, which is really what the question is. And that's where the panic is. And if we fuck it up, then that's up to us. The planet will survive anyway. I think that's all I need to say.
Okay. And there on the 5th row back.
I think there's I'm Sally Diamond, by the way. I think there's a risk of unintended consequences from a lot of solutions to climate change problems, and I'm thinking in particular about putting wind farms on the Isle of Lewis, where there's a lot of carbon locked up in the peat that could be released, and also of biofuels, where rainforests are being cut down to provide those biofuels. And do we understand the science well enough to be able to make the right decisions? And how do we avoid doing more harm than good?
Do you want to...
If I start off on the beauty question, I think it's interesting. If you were to imagine a situation where all of us could start to work a lot less, we're sitting now in the middle of an art gallery. Wouldn't it be nice if we started to think about those sort of things as being beauty and art being something that you people generally create rather than consume, rather than purchase? There's one of the ideas that's floating around at the moment is something called a citizen's income, which would mean basically everyone would be paid enough money to live on to a very basic standard. You'd abolish all of the other kind of benefits and stuff, and so you would just basically say society is going to guarantee you enough to live on. Now, I think if that happened, you'd get an awful lot of really, really bad poetry written. But a lot of bad poetry is far from the worst possible thing that could happen in the world, and maybe you'd also get some occasionally very beautiful poetry written that would never have been written otherwise. In terms of the gentleman who was asking about, the planet will survive, of course the planet will survive in some form or another. I read somewhere recently, and I think this is a very good way of looking at it. Homo sapiens sapiens has been around for around about 100,000 years. For a rather small, rather weak species, we've done astonishingly well in terms of spreading out and basically taking over the planet. But we're about to take our final exams. And we're going to see if we're going to pass or fail very soon.
Why do you say we've done well?
Well, in terms of we've spread out, we've achieved, and we've created the beauty the other lady was talking about. We've done lots of amazing things. We've done lots of good things. Well, what we've created is, for the first time, is we're getting rather philosophical here. We're creating a conscious species. We've created a conscious species that, for the first time in recent years, has actually got to the point where a species that believes in human rights, however imperfectly, we've said we believe that every human being on the planet has a right to survive. That's something no other species has done. We're starting to get to the point where we're starting to say things like the great apes. We're starting to rescue whales that strand themselves on beaches. We are being humane, like no species before us has been. I think I'll ignore that one. Coming on to biofuels, which is much easier. It's interesting because I was thinking about the huge rise in fuel prices, in food prices that we're seeing. Now, of course, for us, it's only an inconvenience. There are already all around the world, from Mexico to Indonesia to all over the place, people who are rioting because food has gone up so much they just can't feed their children. And that the reasons for that are complex. Partly it's climate change, partly it's this rush to biofuels. But of course the rush to biofuels ultimately comes back to climate change. So, a lot of things do come back to the same point eventually.
Martyn.
I studied geology, and it comes up a lot, particularly if you're talking to people who are sceptical about climate change. The idea that, of course the planet will still be here, we'll all be fine, there's been extinctions in the past and so on. And I think people's grasp of the timescales involved since the last extinction to now, and how long we have been here and how fast things are changing is incredibly vague. I think people find it very difficult to understand just how fundamental the changes we are making now are. And how rapid they could be. And it's quite, it is absolutely true that in the 3 previous mass extinctions, 95% of species on the planet died out. And look, it's turned out all right. It's okay again today. But it has taken 65 million years. And, that's an awfully long time. So it's a sort of, it's quite true. It's absolutely true. But it doesn't in any way change the reason that I'm involved in environmentalism, which is because I know of the level of suffering that will happen if over the next 1,000 years, 95% of species are wiped out on this planet because of what we're doing to it. That's the reason I'm doing it, not to save a big lump of rock that's whirling around the sun. There's plenty of those. The question on biofuels and do we know enough? I think we do know enough on biofuels. There's been report after report after report that show that, yes, if you chop down rainforests, you release more carbon into the atmosphere from the chopping and clearing and everything else than you ever save from using the biofuels, or certainly for a very long time. So we do now know enough on that, so that's a bad idea. But as a more general question, no, we never know enough, really. We have to keep seeking answers and keep looking for answers and acting on the best information we have. And, sadly, there is this lag between when the information becomes available and when politicians tend to get hold of it and act on it. And we're seeing that lag with biofuels at the minute. We're seeing politicians continuing to push for it because it seems like a green solution, while the scientists are ever more desperately saying, no, it isn't. It's not going to work.
Question right at the back there. Very, very brief, because we're coming very close to the end of this session.
I think actually we should humbly admit that human beings are the craziest animals on the planet. Wind turbines, I have relations in Denmark, and in Denmark they generally don't have these ugly wind farms. They have wind turbines dotted around so they blend in much better with the general scenery. But also, why the big push for wind turbines when they're hugely inefficient? Why aren't we pushing more for solar electricity panels?
Should I do that?
Why don't you do that, Colin?
Solar electricity panels are a hell of a lot less efficient than big wind turbines, is the bottom line answer. I say that as somebody who's daft enough to spend £20,000 of his own money putting them on my house. So they are a fantastically exciting technology for some point in the future, but they're not the cheapest and most efficient way of generating electricity. At the minute, that is really wind. There's not really two ways of getting around it. If you work out the costs and the electricity you get from it, then wind, well sited, will generate electricity more cheaply than many fossil fuel power stations and certainly than any other renewables. Now, as we look to the future, the reason I was prepared to spend all that money on solar panels, apart from sort of being lucky in the grand lottery of sort of property purchasing in London, which helped, but the reason I was happy to do it is because I think that you have to have early investors in some of the newer technologies, and you have to support those when they are seemingly expensive, because otherwise you never get the development that starts to bring prices down. So I didn't mind doing it, but it's just wrong. Wind isn't inefficient. Wind is a very efficient way of generating renewable electricity, and at the minute is the most efficient, but we shouldn't neglect the others, because at some point in the future they can take over.
That's fine. I've been told we're right on time, so first of all, let me thank you, the audience, and your questions, and Martyn and Natalie here.